Welcome to Dust Jacket, the podcast of Memoria College, where great students study the great books under great teachers. Thank you for being with us. I'm here with Dr. Dan Sheffler, who's professor of philosophy at Memoria College, and we are talking about a great book today, one of the great books on education. It is John Henry Newman's Idea of a University. We're going to do with this what we do in our classes, which is to look at a text closely and discuss it. We're going to focus specifically today on the preface of the book, which in a way is sort of an overview of what Newman talks about for the rest of the book. It's a short section, really. It's only about 15 pages long. If you read nothing else from the book, you could read the preface and get an idea at least of what it's about. It is one of the great statements about university education, but I think, as we'll discover as we discuss this, that it is more broadly applicable than just a university education. It's really about education itself. So I'm going to start out, Dan, welcome. I want to start out just talking a little bit about who John Henry Newman was. He looms large in the history of modern thought, particularly in the history of modern Christian thought. Who is he, and why is he important?
Man, John Henry Newman is someone that I find endlessly fascinating and provocative. Just by chance, last night we had a birthday party for my son, and my mother is apparently getting into John Henry Newman and handed me a biography of Newman. So I think he has widespread appeal. He was a Victorian character. I think he's very much characteristic of...
By Victorian, what is that?
He's very much characteristic, I think, of 19th century British life. He came out of the Oxford movement. In fact, he's one of the founding figures of the Oxford movement, which was a movement in the early part of the 19th century within Anglicanism, where a group of students there in Oxford began investigating the church fathers, reading more deeply in church history, becoming more interested in the liturgical traditions of the church, and sought a revival within Anglicanism of that kind of historical Christianity. And Newman spent the first half of his life really within the Anglican Church, ended up becoming a minister within the Church of England, and then he through that put him on a trajectory over a long course of years to convert to Catholicism. And
some in the Oxford movement did that, and others did not.
Some did, and others did not. And as you can imagine, this caused controversy in his day to have one of the chief leaders of that movement jump ship, and caused some tension with others, his friends that he had been previously close to within the Oxford movement. And he went on to become a priest in the Catholic Church, and eventually became a cardinal, and
hence Cardinal Newman.
Hence Cardinal. You'll hear Cardinal Newman a lot. And just a few years ago, he was canonized. So now we can say Saint John Henry Newman.
All right. Now, the idea of a university. Why did he write this book?
Well, there was a very specific historical situation. This is what we would call an occasional book. It was written for a particular occasion, and that was that there had been a mandate from Rome to found a Catholic university in Ireland, and Newman was involved with that founding, and so the idea of the university was originally composed as a series of lectures addressing specific questions surrounding the founding of that Catholic University of Ireland, and sort of giving a vision for that university, answering the question, what is a university? What are we doing here as educators? Is it really possible to have a Christian university? Is it possible to have a Catholic university? Does that just make, if it is a Catholic university, does that just make it something on the fringes of society as a whole? Can we really teach things like physics and chemistry and literature as a specifically Catholic university?
And in his discussion of this, is what he is saying about a Catholic university, is what he's saying confined just to Catholic education, or is it something that pertains outside of that?
Well, I think some of what he says is certainly very Catholic specific. It has to do with questions of church hierarchy and church authority and the role of the Catholic Church in Britain at that time, which was there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, and of course it's tied up in the Irish question within British history. So some of it is specifically Catholic, and I think it's important to recognize that. But some of the themes that he brings up have to do with foundational issues in philosophy generally, and I think could be profitably read by an agnostic or an atheist. And much of it has to do with questions that I think are universal to all Christians. What is the relationship between faith and reason? What's the relationship between revelation and what we can know by in the natural sciences, for instance?
Now, this book is over 170 years old, if I'm calculating right. The first part of the book was published in 1852, the second part in 1854. That's a long time ago. Was there? Why is this relevant to us today? I mean, he's talking. Are his theories of what education should be, university education in particular, but really education in general, are they outdated in any way? Is there anything about our time which is fundamentally different from what he's talking about?
When I read this book and taught it to some of the Memoria College students this summer, I was reminded again of how shockingly that is not the case. How much the questions that we're batting around in 2021 about the role of secularism in education, the division between sort of public education and classical Christian schools, science and revealed truth. I was even a little bit surprised how modern, how contemporary he sounds, even though this is written in the 1850s.
Yeah, that's what struck me is for a book to be that old and to be directly relevant, like you say, to the educational debates that we're having today. You're mentioning some of these. The STEM one is a big one you hear about now. You're going to, education should consist of teaching children narrow technical skills for the job market and this sort of thing. I want to take several passages here and just read those. Our viewers will see those on the screen. I'm going to take this first one. It's, again, from the preface of The Idea of a University. It's page 3 in most of the editions, I've noticed. And here's what he says. The view taken of a university in these discourses is the following, that it is a place of teaching universal knowledge. This implies that its object is, on the one hand, intellectual, not moral, and on the other, that it is the diffusion and extension of knowledge rather than the advancement. If its object were scientific and philosophical discovery, I do not see why a university should have students. If religious training, I do not see how it can be the seat of literature and science. Now, he's saying two things here, and it seems like these two things are delineated by the two italicized words in there, teaching and knowledge. And I want to talk about the first one first. He says, that the object of the university is intellectual, not moral. Don't we usually think that education, particularly Christian education, should teach morality? Should we really exclude morality from education, as this, at least on the surface, sounds like he's doing? Why can't education be moral or religious and teach knowledge at the same time? What is he saying here?
Right. Well, so this is a question I think that every good teacher ought to ask themselves. If you care about your students at all, of course, you want them to become good people. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a healthy drive, especially within classical Christian education circles, to want to inculcate the virtues, want to teach directly moral knowledge. But Newman makes a point later on in the book where he says, look, you're going to get confused if you think that knowledge can save you. That learning is not the same thing as Jesus Christ. And that the university is not the same thing as the church. And so, yes, hopefully there will be a salutary effect of a Christian education. Yes, we should, in all of our classrooms, we should be cultivating virtues. But that on its own is not going to make a person good. There's more to it that we need. And if you focus just on that, then you lose a very real good that a university provides, which is comprehensive knowledge. Mm-hmm. And this is really the core of the argument of the book, that the idea of a university, what a university is for, is providing comprehensive knowledge of the whole of things.
So is he then necessarily in conflict with what Alistair MacIntyre says in his book After Virtue, that there's something morally salutary about history and literature, that this is the way that we learn how to be good? Would Newman disagree with that?
No, I don't think he would. I except with just the one word at the last of what you said in that last clause is the way. Just okay. With the word the. So
it's not. It shouldn't be. It's not primary in an educational setting, but it is secondary. Maybe,
right.
tertiary.
Right. Exactly. So I don't think. In fact, I think Newman fairly clearly says that you can gain certain virtues by being exposed to literature. You can gain certain virtues by learning how to think through in a logical and rigorous way in a scientific setting and hold yourself accountable to the objective facts and learn how to extract yourself from the situation. Those are definitely helpful practices, but that's not the primary objective of science as such, and it's more closely related to the central objectives of literature, but I would even say in literature and in poetry, that's not the primary objective, is to make us good.
So we could believe, for example, that the ordering of our intellects could have some effect on the ordering of our souls, for example, in the ordering of our wills.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And in fact, it may be a necessary component in a broader understanding of a moral education. But I think in addition to saying that that's not the primary purpose of science or literature, he also wants to say that if literature was the way by which we become good people, well, then the church is really unnecessary. Faith in Christ is really a nice little addendum. You just go read Homer and you're all set. Yeah. So if we're going to have a properly Christian education, then we need to put education in its place. We can't put more on education in terms of the moral development of man than it can really bear. But we shouldn't ignore the ways in which, on the other hand, it has a moral impact. It's not morally neutral by any means.
Yeah. It's still wrong to cheat on a test. All right, well, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. The purpose of the Memoria College Master's Program in the Classics is to enable teachers, school administrators, and students to enter the great discussion, the conversation about truth, goodness, and beauty that's been going on in the Western world for over 2,000 years. We do this by reading the great books, talking about them, and writing about them. Our tutors help students to encounter the great classics of theology, philosophy, literature, ethics, political theory, law, and science. There's a lot you can do with great teachers and great books. But you can do even more when you also have great students, and we do.
And I have said this, and I've told my students that I've been teaching at undergraduate level for almost 20 years, and my Memoria College students are the best students I've ever taught. They're on fire for classical education, and they want to learn, and they're very smart, and the collaborative discussion was just out of this world, and I felt as if I was being taught as much as I was teaching.
Our liberal arts curriculum may strike many people as absolutely insane. These great books won't necessarily help you get a better job. So this might leave you wondering what the point of all this reading is. So what are the liberal arts for? Most fundamentally, they're for themselves. They're for your decision making and your thinking ability. They're for your capacity to communicate effectively and clearly. They're for your decision making. They're for your character and your growth.
Let's face it, we only have so much time in our busy modern lives. We need to make sure we keep in mind Thomas Aquinas' great admonition. The slightest knowledge of the greatest things is greater than the greatest knowledge of the slightest things. In other words, we need to make our time count.
To learn to love language, to be steeped in history by sound reading and long conversation, to compose a sentence worthy of remembering, to do all this is to cast off, I think, the blinders of self, to leave Plato's cave, and to accustom our eyes to a light that blinds, but once our spiritual eyes adjust, can elevate and ennoble.
Memoria College. Great books, great teachers, great students. His second point in here seems to be that a university education is not, he says, about furthering the extension of knowledge. What does he mean by that?
Well, there was an idea floating around in the middle of the 19th century, and this is where the modern research university comes from, where the idea was that the university is primarily a place for the most brilliant people in the age to go and do their scientific research or go and do their academic treatise writing, and that the students are there to kind of just bask in that glow and learn how to do original research for themselves. But I think Newman's point here in the text is well put, where he says, look, if that were really the point, then really why have students at all? Well, if you just want to have a think tank, go have a think tank.
And have we all not experienced the professor who really doesn't want to be in the classroom himself, and as a result of that, the students really don't want to be there either. I just remember a particular economics professor that I had when I was at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and I remember him saying at the beginning of the class that he was a professor there at the university, but didn't even know he was going to end up having a class because he was there in the economics department to do research, and as a consequence, he was a terrible teacher. So you can easily see how these two goals can come into conflict, because good skills at research do not necessarily and often are not combined in the same person with good teaching, which is why we're sitting here in Louisville, Kentucky, and I remember when the University of Kentucky hired Lee Todd, who was somebody from the tech industry, to lead the university, and he announced that the goal of the university was to become a top 20 research university. And in my mind, I just thought, that just means we're going to ignore undergraduate education, because those are in many ways conflicting goals. And we try to do both of those in the same institutions, and one does not help the other and sometimes detracts from the other. And I've often wondered if we need to really just separate those out institutionally. And if you want a research institute, fine, go do that. But if you're a high school student and you're looking for a university and you want to go there because you want to learn, then a research institute's not the place to go. Which is why a lot of smaller colleges are teaching schools. And you're not, this is the other thing, as a professor, how do you gain rank in your profession? Well, what it is now is all geared towards research and discovering more knowledge. It's how much you publish in prestigious journals that only the people who are in that particular subfield of that field read. And so that doesn't contribute to good teaching. It doesn't contribute to the inculcation of knowledge in the students who are there. In fact, you can see in many ways how it detracts from it. You spent more time in the university than I have. I don't know if you've seen that, but in my own much shorter academic career than yours, I've seen it. He goes on, there are other institutions far more suited to act as instruments of stimulating philosophical inquiry and extending the boundaries of our knowledge than the university. And of course, this problem is worse now because he says philosophical inquiry. Well, now we have science and technology, and this has really taken over our institutions and really powered that impulse, don't you think, in the university?
And so much the better. I mean, it's fine for there to be institutions that are devoted to extending our scientific knowledge of the cosmos, institutions which are think tanks on public policy. But I think what he's encouraging us to consider is that that's really just not the same thing as a university. That's not what a university is primarily for. If that does go on, then that's a secondary effect of a good university.
Right. And of course, one of the reasons for that, obviously, is probably money, right? Because you're going to get grants from certain corporations to conduct research that is beneficial to those corporations, but where's the money for just teaching students?
Right.
So there's a little bit of a
well, this is part of how the culture sort of developed, because there is plenty of money for scientific research that has practical applications in industry. There's plenty of money out there for public policy think tanks to advance certain political causes and that kind of thing. But there's not really a lot of money out there for somebody to say true things about Shakespeare that have generally been said before, and to simply pass that knowledge on, to pass the torch on. It doesn't have the same kind of economic viability. So the people who are really into Shakespeare, where are they going to get their funding to conduct their original Shakespeare research? Well, you got to milk the tuition dollars.
There's very little financial incentive for the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right. All right. Well, let me go on to another section here. He says, I would have him first. He's talking about the person who wants the university to pursue new knowledge, basically. I would have him, first of all, ask himself the previous question. What he conceives to be the reason contemplated by the Holy See, he's talking about the Pope here because that's what the context is, in recommending just now to the Irish hierarchy the establishment of a Catholic university. Has the Supreme Pontiff recommended it for the sake of the sciences, which are to be the matter and not rather the students, who are to be the subjects of its teaching? Has he any obligation or duty at all towards secular knowledge as such? Would it become his apostolic ministry and his descent from the fishermen to have a zeal for the Baconian or other philosophy of man for its own sake? Is the vicar of Christ bound by office or by vow to be the preacher of the theory of gravitation or a martyr of electromagnetism? Or rather, does he not contemplate such achievements of the intellect, as far as he contemplates them, solely and simply in their relation to the interests of revealed truth? Surely he does for the sake of religion. If he looks with satisfaction on strong temporal governments which promise perpetuity, it is for the sake of religion. And if he encourages and patronizes art and science, it is for the sake of religion. He rejoices in the widest and most philosophical systems of intellectual education from an intimate conviction that truth is his real ally, as it is his profession, and that knowledge and reason are sure ministers of faith. What's the point he's making there?
Well, I think primarily what he's driving at, it's connected to this question that we were just batting around a moment ago about the relationship between morality and literature. That if the church is founding a university, if the Pope is giving this call for a Catholic university in Ireland, then that's not so that professors can go and do physics just for its own sake, but that it's serving somehow the religious life of the students. Now, it's not constituting the whole of the religious life of the students, because if that were so, then what would there be any need for the sacraments and the church? But it is in an important way cultivating that religious life, and the fact that the church is giving its patronage to the arts and to the sciences, to literature, to the humanities, is evidence that these wide forms of learning really are positive contributors to a person's religious life and that religious development in the students.
And then in another passage, kind of addressing some of these general points we've just been talking about, he says, "Such is a university in its essence, and independently of its relation to the church, but practically speaking, it cannot fulfill its object duly, such as I have described it, without the church's assistance. Or to use the theological term, the church is necessary for its integrity. Not that its main characters are changed by this incorporation. It still has the office of intellectual education, but the church steadies it in the performance of that office." What's that?
Well, so this, I think this touches on sort of some specifics of Catholic theology and the Catholic understanding of the relationship between faith and reason and the church and the world. So where he says, "Such is a university in its essence and independently of its relation to the church," he's I think acknowledging that there is a possibility of learning, of some kind of knowledge that is natural knowledge. It's important to recognize that there is some possibility of what we call natural theology, a knowledge of the truth about God, a basic knowledge of the truth about the world that human beings can arrive at independent of the special revelation of the scriptures or of
So you
the
could be
church.
a non-Christian, and you're still able to comprehend the world.
Right. And so in principle, we could have a university independent of the church that has some kind of comprehensive inquiry. Okay. But he says, but practically speaking, okay, given the actual dangers that obtain human sin, human pride, the political vicissitudes of the Victorian period, or of really any period, it's necessary that the university have the authority of the church speak to it, ground it, check it when it goes off the rails, and be a guide to that truth. So what he says is that the church is necessary for its integrity, for it remaining true to what it really ought to be, that essence that we spoke of in the first sentence.
Right. Now, gentlemen take it on the chin here among some critics. He says, for instance, this is on page 4, for instance, some persons may be tempted to complain that I have servilely followed the English idea of a university to the disparagement of that knowledge which I profess to be so strenuously upholding. And they may anticipate that an academical system formed upon my model will result in nothing better or higher than the production of that antiquated variety of human nature and remnant of feudalism, as they consider it, called a gentleman. Well, and the reader's thinking, wait, what's wrong with a gentleman?
Right. Well, so I think
Don't we want more of them, not fewer of them?
He is, I think, speaking to the particular time period a little bit, because when he's speaking of the English model of a university, the English have what they call public schools. And there's a little bit to an American audience, a sort of reverse, because the public schools in the UK are the elite schools, places like Eton, or Eton. Whereas for us, the public schools are, sort of for everyone, and the private schools are what the elite go to. And the idea there of such schools is to produce a class of gentlemen that are going to that have a certain leadership, certain demeanor, certain set of values, what Matthew Arnold calls muscular Christianity, and the Britain is going to send these men out into its far-flung empire at the time to be the public face of Britain and the administrators, the bureaucrats of this empire.
Sort of a Greece for the British imperial system, we could say, right? I mean, these are the guys they're going to send to be administrators in Africa and in India and in all the British colonies, and that requires a certain system of certain social familiarity with the social system that is necessary for that to work properly, right?
Right. And so the criticism would be that, that's a certain kind of bureaucratic ideal, but it's really rather below the level of what we should be aiming at when we're setting out to form a fully Christian education.
Yeah, I mean, he says in another place on page 9 that those things aren't really the essence of that, but they can be the product of the kind of education he's talking about. He says, our desideratum, the thing required as essential, is not the manners and habits of gentlemen. These can be and are acquired in various other ways, by good society, by foreign travel, by the innate grace and dignity of the Catholic mind. But the command over our own powers, the instinctive, just estimate of things as they pass before us, which sometimes indeed is a natural gift, but commonly is not gained without much effort and the exercise of years. So he's saying, I guess that a gentleman can be produced in other ways, but only these things can be produced in the kind of education he's talking about.
Right. Well, actually, I think what he's really saying is that there's sort of two levels to what it is to be a gentleman. There's the habits and the manners of a gentleman, holding a door for ladies and having a certain cadence to your speech and pronouncing your vowels in that aristocratic way. Okay. And yes, that can be had in all these other, you don't really need a university for that. But there's the mind of a gentleman. That he uses that phrase in one of the later discourses. The mind of a gentleman is something he wants to say that is above the level of what these critics are criticizing. It's something more than just this kind of exterior polish. But it's also, he wants to say, below the level of a saint. below the level of true Christian virtue. So that is the objective of the university, a mind that has learned a certain habit of thought, a way of thinking justly about a variety of views. And the core is the ability to see all of these different subjects, science over here, literature over here, ethics, theology, as an interconnected web. And he calls this a comprehensive view of things. Now, that doesn't mean that the person who graduates successfully from a university is going to know everything about everything, but they're going to have touched on all of these different areas in such a way that they're all related to one another. And so he sees the world, he sees reality, he's learned to see truth as a single field of inquiry that are addressed by all these more specific sciences.
Yeah, and there was, I wonder sometimes if, because some of what he's talking about here is what we would call manners, right? The relation of manners to knowledge, the relation of manners to morality. I've often wondered, Began Garoyan, another one of our Memoria College professors, wrote an article for Christianity Today a number of years ago. This is off topic just a little bit here, but I think it's related. Called Dorm Brothel, and it was about what the activities students were engaging in at a Catholic university that he was at. He's an Armenian Orthodox theologian actually, but he was teaching at a Catholic university, and he called the article Dorm Brothel because of what was going on in the dorms at this presumably Christian university. And he gave a speech about this at a conference I was at, and it greatly discomforted the mothers, particularly in the room, and some of the homeschooling mothers were coming out of there just sort of distraught and worried about what their children could become when they send them off to even a Christian university, and they came up to me and started talking, and I said, well, it's also important, morality, and the morality you teach your children in their Sunday school class is some protection, but quite frankly, you need a little more than that. You need a system of manners, just what the expectations are among your peers about the way you act politely. Sometimes politeness is an additional protection in these cases. And I remember talking with somebody who went to a nearby private university, to the University of Kentucky, and they were talking about how they were students there, and they were talking about how they a little bit looked down on the UK students because they were engaging in that, but these kids were from a class, a higher class of people where the expectations of just politeness were higher, and it added another layer of protection. It's just something you didn't do, so that you can have the county next to me sometimes had the highest teen pregnancy rate in the country. But it's also among the most churched counties in the country, because I don't think there's not a system of social graces there. It's just not right to do in polite society, which is an additional protection to that. And I don't know how that's directly relevant here, but talking about the gentleman, I want to stand up for gentlemen because they're upholding this system of manners that is good for society and that helps even in the educational project.
Right. Well, I don't think Newman would disagree with any of that. I think certainly there's this sphere of conduct that is not directly moral, but it does provide the basis for moral conduct. And I liked your words of kind of protection. It creates this sphere within which doing the right thing becomes easier. But I think.
But can we also say that in the Victorian era, one of the distinguishing features of the Victorian era, Gertrude Himmelfarb talks a lot about this, is that the underlying Christian foundation of culture and thought had been removed. There's this sort of a treason of the clerks, treason of the intellectuals who are leaving the church. They become skeptics. So what they do, what the Victorians do, is they clutch onto morality and make morality their religion.
Right.
Is that lurking anywhere in here? Is anything Newman is saying relevant to that sort of problem of the Victorian era?
I think it is in a number of different complex ways. But I would think what Newman would say is that those habits, the broad manners, are good. You should get them in these various other ways: by good society, by foreign travel, by the innate grace and dignity of the Catholic mind. That this is part of your broader upbringing and is something that you should take to the university. It's almost a prerequisite for the university education. But then there's another level, even before we get to this morality proper, which is the gentleman's mind, which is learning how to think like a gentleman, learning how to hear out an argument fairly, learning how to listen and really make sure that you understand before you give your own opinion, and those kinds of habits. And I would think that another problem is that you're pointing to is people learn about the specifics of Christian morality, but not only do they not have this lowest tier of just the basic habits and graces of polite society, but they also have not been taught how to think. They haven't gained that comprehensive vision of reality.
And isn't he talking about that there on page 12? But these discourses are directed simply to the consideration of the aims and principles of education. Suffice it then to say here that I hold very strongly that the first step in intellectual training is to impress upon a boy's mind the idea of science, method, order, principle, and system, of rule and exception, of richness and harmony. Is this what we today want to term thinking skills, or should it be?
Well, I think Newman would have a serious problem with what people today call critical thinking skills or thinking skills. In fact, I've written about this in the Classical Teacher. You can go read.
A fine magazine, I hear.
I've heard it's a good periodical. Because the basic problem there, and this is something that Newman addresses throughout the book, is that what many people mean by critical thinking skills is learning how to critique something or think for yourself, they'll say, without any content. So they will explicitly say, okay, well, just forget about what this is actually about. Forget about actually knowing any scientific facts or knowing the capital of France. Tell me what you think about the social problems of today. And a lot of it's really just nonsense, because how am I supposed to think for myself if I don't have any data on which to build my view of things? And so what Newman is advocating here in this how to think, okay, I'm going to just read that quote again because I think it's so good. Suffice it then to say here that I hold very strongly that the first step in intellectual training is to impress upon a boy's mind the idea of science, method, order, principle, and system, of rule and exception, of richness and harmony. What he's talking about here is the way in which all the facts hold together into a system with rules that admit of exception. That there's this incredible richness, but that richness of facts holds together in a harmonious order. That we don't have one set of facts for science and another set of facts for morality and another set of facts for literature, but that all of these things hold together. And by that, they're going to learn a certain method of thinking. So you have to learn the content first, and the content as related together is going to teach you how to think.
So he goes on from that point to say this is commonly and excellently done by making him begin with grammar. What does grammar have to do with that ordering of the mind that he's talking about in that other passage?
Well, in the order of classical education, we need that grammar phase to just be able to break down a complex thought. Learning grammar is not just about learning language, but language is the vehicle for our thoughts. And anything beyond the simplest thought is going to have subordinate clauses. It's going to have complex relationships between clauses, being able to notice that this is the subject and this is the verb and this word over here is modifying this concept. And so that learning grammar, again, let me emphasize, is more than just learning vocabulary and some rules.
Discrete knowledge. Yeah.
It's learning how to process complicated thoughts, and that's a foundation for everything else that follows.
Yeah, and he goes on from there. He said the second science, this page 12, the second science is the mathematics. This should follow grammar, still with the same object, vis-a-vis to give him a conception of development and arrangement from and around a common center. Hence it is that chronology and geography are so necessary for him when he reads history, which is otherwise little better than a storybook. Hence to metrical composition when he reads poetry. He goes on about this. Order, right?
Right.
He's talking about these subjects, even history, which is mostly focused on content, but even there, you need to understand the order of history, and you need to have common reference points, and that's why dates are important, not because they're important in and of themselves, but because they give you an order of history in which you can place every bit of discrete knowledge you have about it, right?
Right. All of these subjects that we just mentioned, mathematics, grammar, geography, history, metrical composition, poetry, they train the mind to see all the truths of the world as hanging together.
Yes.
They're not discrete, isolated facts, but they hang together into a total cosmology. I had a student at a we'll leave it as an unnamed university, an undergraduate student. They were supposed to do a little bit of background research on the book of Genesis and tell me when it was written and what the context of that part of the world was in very broad terms. And they said that this book was written in Egypt while the pyramids were being built after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And it when I read that sentence, it struck me that in order to write a sentence like that, the little bits and bobs of historical knowledge have to be hanging together in that student's mind in a completely disordered fashion, right? That to not even be able to place the Romans and the Egyptians, let alone the Bible, forget about the Bible for a second, but just the basic relationship of the Romans to the Egyptians, they didn't have a cosmos. They didn't have an ordered whole in their minds. Their view of the world and the past and events must have been all helter-skelter. And this is a university freshman that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So these kinds of subjects train all of those pieces to come pull together into a single whole, which is going to be your view of the world.
Yeah. Now, before we end this, I wanted to talk a little bit about something at the end of this preface that is kind of a little bit different from the rest of this chapter, and it's really a kind of a cultural critique he's leveling here. He used the word, and I read this book before and I didn't notice it, and then I read it again. I see the word he comes up with viewiness. Viewiness.
It's delightful, isn't it?
Yeah, which reminds me of Stephen Colbert cooked up that term, truthiness, by which he meant the quality of seeming or being felt to be true, even if not necessarily true. Whereas viewiness is this idea that everybody, as William Barrett says in his book Irrational Man, walks around with a digest of culture in their head. We have all these sort of factoids or opinions we have of different things going on in society, and we think we're well informed because we have all this trivia knocking around in there. He says on page 13, an intellectual man, as the world now conceives of him, is one who is full of views on all subjects of philosophy, on all matters of the day. It is almost thought a disgrace not to have a view at a moment's notice on any question from the personal advent to the cholera or mesmerism. Every quarter of a year, every month, every day, there must be a supply for the gratification of the public of new and luminous theories on the subjects of religion, foreign politics, home politics, civil economy, finance, trade, agriculture, immigration, and the colonies. Slavery, the goldfields, German philosophy, the French Empire, Wellington, Peel, Ireland, must all be practiced on day after day by what are called original thinkers. As the great man's guest must produce his good stories or songs at the evening banquet, as the platform orator exhibits his telling facts at midday, so the journalist lies under the stern obligation of extemporizing his lucid views, leading ideas, and nutshell truths for the breakfast table. I thought when I was hearing this of this story, Michael Oakeshott, the British conservative philosopher, was asked on some BBC show what his opinion was on the European Union. And his response was, I don't see why I should be required to have an opinion about that. And I thought, there's some intellectual humility going on right there. Joseph Epstein mentions this remark in his book, in V.S. Naipaul's book, Gorillas, his novel. And the narrator referencing this one female character in there said, she had a great many opinions, but taken together, these did not add up to a point of view. Is this a problem today?
I think it's an enormous problem today, perhaps far more than in Cardinal Newman's day, because of the proliferation of social media. You know, I mean, in the 1850s, there was at least a something of a bar you had to meet to be able to get your views in print or before the public eye. They didn't have radio, they didn't have TV. But now, you know, everybody and their brother with
his own
any 2 cents to rub together
right.
Can put their views out there for public digestion. And I think one of the very first habits in the mind of the gentleman is the habit of saying, I don't know.
Right.
When you're asked for a view on something, and you maybe you do in fact know something about it, but not enough to have a responsible opinion about it.
Yeah.
The gentleman will learn to say, I simply don't know. And that's fine.
Another point in favor of gentlemen.
Exactly. And the second habit will be the habit of, if you are going to have an opinion on something, holding yourself accountable to really do your homework and find out whether what you're saying is really true, whether it really hangs together with a whole picture of reality, whether you have evidence for it, or whether you're simply doing what Heidegger calls idle talk, which is just repeating views that you heard from somebody else, or you heard on the news, or you saw on Facebook or something like that. Right. And you're just passing along a thing without actually knowing anything about it.
Well, it's just one more thing in this book again, written 170 years ago, that makes it so relevant to what's going on today. Well, thank you for joining us today on The Dust Jacket, podcast of Memoria College. Come visit us at memoriacollege.org, where we have great books, great teachers, and great students. Thanks.